At 8:10 on the morning of April 16, 1947, 8 longshoremen entered the number 4 hold of the cargo ship Grandcamp. The air looked clear. Then one man smelled smoke. It was rising through a narrow space between the cargo and the steel skin of the ship. When the men pulled away several bags, they found a small fire 10 to 15 feet below them. They lowered 2 jugs of drinking water and a small fire extinguisher. Neither stopped it. A hose followed, but someone warned that water would damage the fertilizer. The valve stayed closed. The men were ordered out. Wooden hatch covers went back into place, the ventilators were covered, and the crew began pumping steam into the sealed hold. 52 minutes after the smoke was found, the fertilizer detonated. The Grandcamp disappeared inside the blast. Hot steel and burning cargo crossed the waterfront, tanks opened, warehouses collapsed, a chemical plant burned, the responding fire department was destroyed. Nearly 16 hours later, a second loaded ship exploded in the same harbor. The first spark was never proved. Investigators believed someone may have discarded a cigarette, but their experiments could not settle it. What they could identify was the system around the spark: combustible packaging, a confined hold, heat, pressure, misunderstood cargo, weak controls, and an industrial port with almost no distance between one failure and the next. Texas City stood on the western shore of Galveston Bay, close enough to the Gulf of Mexico for ocean traffic and close enough to Houston for rail and industry. The land was flat and only a few feet above the water. Dredging had turned the shoreline into a deep water port. Rail tracks ran straight toward the piers. During the Second World War, the port grew around oil, rubber, and chemical production. By 1947, Texas City had 2 large chemical plants, 3 large refineries, tank farms, warehouses, a grain elevator, and a tin smelter. Roughly 16,000 people lived there. Many more came in each day to work. The waterfront was a compact machine. The Monsanto plant sat only a few hundred feet from the general cargo docks. Oil tanks stood behind it. Warehouses ran along the slips. Ships, railcars, pipes, process vessels, and homes occupied the same low horizon. Efficiency had shortened every distance, including the distance a fire had to travel. Fires at the docks were not unknown. Residents sometimes came to watch them. A ship fire could mean smoke, water, and a story to carry home. It did not usually mean that the ship itself might vanish. On this cool Wednesday morning, the colored smoke above the Grandcamp began drawing people toward the waterfront. Nothing in the shape of the city warned them. There was no blast wall around the port and no empty exclusion zone between hazardous cargo and daily life. The material in Hold 4 arrived in ordinary paper sacks marked as fertilizer. The danger was present, but it had not been made visible to the people handling it or the people walking closer. This concentration had also made Texas City prosperous. Refineries and chemical plants offered wages that drew families from across the Bay region. Ships kept the rail yards and warehouses moving. The same waterfront paid for homes, shops, and schools. Ammonium nitrate had long served 2 different purposes. Its nitrogen made it valuable to farmers. Its oxygen made it useful in explosives when mixed with fuel. During the war, American plants produced enormous quantities for military use. After the war, some of those plants were turned toward fertilizer for farms at home and recovery overseas. The product shipped through Texas City was fertilizer-grade. It was not a crate of dynamite waiting for a match. Under ordinary conditions, investigators did not classify it as a high explosive. It was an oxidizer, a substance that could make other materials burn much harder. Its danger changed with heat, contamination, pressure, confinement, and mass. The fertilizer was packed in 100-pound bags made from 6 layers of moisture-resistant paper. Clay helped keep the granules separate. A thin coating that could include paraffin, rosin, and petrolatum resisted dampness and caking. The treatment made the material easier to store and spread. It also placed organic material beside a powerful oxidizer. Before Texas City, more than 2 million tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer had been produced or imported in North America over several years. Vast quantities moved without catastrophe. 75,000 tons had passed through this port in the previous 6 months. Repetition created confidence. The cargo became familiar long before its failure conditions became familiar. Regulations already called ammonium nitrate a dangerous oxidizing material, but the warning did not travel well. Bills of lading called it fertilizer compound, with ammonium nitrate in parentheses. The bags lacked a conspicuous hazard label. Longshoremen later testified that they treated it like manure, fertilizer, or cement. The rule existed, the working knowledge did not. The shipment also passed through a long chain. Federal plants made the fertilizer. Commercial companies handled production and resale. Government bills of lading moved it by rail. The French Supply Council arranged export. Independent longshoremen loaded the ships. Each organization handled one portion of the journey, while the material's behavior in a burning ship's hold belonged clearly to none of them. The Grandcamp had begun life as an American Liberty ship during the war. It was more than 400 feet long, built to carry cargo across an ocean under pressure. Afterward, it passed to France and took the name of a Normandy coast. In April 1947, it came to Texas City to load fertilizer for European agriculture. Its holds already contained the mixed cargo of ordinary trade: peanuts, tobacco, cotton, sisal twine, and oil field equipment. 16 cases of small arms ammunition sat in Hold 5. The ammunition worried the crew when the fire began, but investigators found no evidence that it caused the detonation. The far greater mass was labeled fertilizer. Loading began on April 11th. Rain interrupted the work repeatedly, so crews covered the holds to keep the paper bags dry. By the morning of April 16th, about 2,300 tons had been stowed in holds 2 and 4. Hold 4 alone contained roughly 880 tons and was about 3/4 full. Paper covered the wooden dunnage and cargo battens so the bags would not touch the ship's steel skin. The arrangement protected the fertilizer from moisture and abrasion. It also filled the hold with surfaces that could burn. A narrow gap remained between the stacked cargo and the hull. That gap is where the workers first saw smoke. The workers received no special stowage instructions for the nitrate, torn bags were not always repaired, smoking control was lax, and the English-speaking crews did not have clear English warning signs at the work area. One terminal executive considered the cargo a normal operation. In that setting, danger had no owner with enough authority to stop the routine. Normal work created its own pressures. Rain had already delayed loading. Paper sacks had to stay dry. A hose stream into the hold could ruin cargo and interrupt the sailing schedule. Those concerns were real during ordinary handling. Once fire appeared, they should have yielded to cooling the nitrate. Nobody at the hatch had been prepared to recognize that change quickly enough. When the crew entered hold 4 at about 8:10, the space appeared clear. Smoke came later. That timing allowed several possibilities. Something may have been dropped that morning, something may have smoldered overnight and revived when the hatch opened. The Bureau of Mines favored careless smoking, but its own tests could not prove the source. The first response was immediate but too small. 2 jugs of water and a handheld extinguisher could not reach enough burning material. Then the crew lowered a full hose. It could have supplied the volume investigators later judged essential. Someone feared damage to the cargo and the water remained off while the fire continued below. The crew withdrew and covered the hatch. Tarpaulins closed the ventilators. These were familiar ways to protect cargo and prepare a ship's smothering system. Here, they kept heat and decomposition gases inside a hold packed with paper, wood, oil-coated granules, and hundreds of tons of oxidizer. The response turned the cargo space into a pressure chamber. Steam entered at about 8:30. The system was meant to smother ordinary shipboard fire by displacing air, but heated ammonium nitrate could release oxygen into the reaction. Steam did not remove that support. It brought more heat into the closed compartment. Investigators later called its use one of 3 grievous errors that hastened the detonation. The crew also remembered the ammunition in hold 5. Workers removed only a few cases before the first mate ordered everyone off the ship. Most of the crew and longshoremen moved away from the pier, although many remained nearby. Their fear was attached to the wrong cargo. 16 boxes looked dangerous. Thousands of paper sacks did not. Closing a hatch and using steam were not irrational responses to every shipboard fire. A smothering system depended on cutting off outside air. The error was applying that familiar method to an oxidizing cargo already decomposing under heat. Procedure supplied an answer before the people on deck understood the question. The machinery worked as designed and still moved the hold toward disaster. The Texas City terminal siren sounded around 8:25. Fire trucks arrived from the volunteer department. Photographs taken between roughly 8:37 and 8:50 show hoses crossing the dock and at least one stream reaching the ship. With the hatch covered, water struck the exterior. Investigators found no evidence that it reached the burning cargo. The smoke changed as the reaction grew. Witnesses described black, yellow, reddish-brown, and brilliant orange. Nitrogen oxide fumes rose over the ship and drifted across the docks. Around 9, one account said water flowing over the deck was vaporizing. Inside the closed hold, no instrument recorded the temperature. Outside, the hull itself had become a warning. The warning was not understood in time. Firefighters knew ships and ordinary dock fires. They did not know that this fertilizer could detonate after prolonged heating in a confined hold. The bags, paperwork, and routine had concealed that possibility from nearly everyone. Men approached with the tools of a fire when the event was becoming something else. The smoke drew spectators to the waterfront. Roads near the slip became crowded. 2 small aircraft circled overhead. Some people came from nearby plants, others came from town. They were watching a bright column against a clear morning sky. The danger carried no familiar shape, and the perimeter did not move far enough to match it. Around the ship, hot paper and small balls of fire began lifting from the hatch. The smoke towered higher. Fire crews continued working. The clock passed 9:10. The last 2 minutes did not announce themselves as a countdown. They looked like the same emergency, only worse, until the chemistry and pressure inside the hold crossed a boundary no one outside could see. At 9:12 a.m., the ammonium nitrate in hold 4 detonated. The blast disintegrated the Grandcamp. Hundreds of tons of cargo, bunker oil, and ship structure rose above the port. The first pressure front crossed the docks before any human reaction could begin. The fire department, nearby workers, ship personnel, and spectators stood inside its path. Water was driven out of the north slip and returned across the low waterfront in a wave reported at more than 15 feet. A 500-ton steel barge was lifted from the water and placed on shore. The motion was not one clean force. Air pressure, displaced water, fragments, fire, and collapsing structures arrived almost together. Hot ship fragments crossed the industrial district. One 30-foot drill stem weighing about 2,700 pounds landed 13,000 feet away and buried itself in clay. Burning sisal twine and other cargo fell like moving ignition points. The importance of those fragments was not how far they flew, it was what stood beneath them. The Monsanto plant lost buildings, control equipment, pipes, and process lines. Oil and styrene spread across flooded ground. Tanks were pierced or crushed. Warehouses along the slips vanished or burned. The first explosion did not produce one fire. It produced a port full of broken containment, each release waiting for heat. Across Texas City, roofs shifted, doors left their frames, and glass entered rooms that had seemed far from the docks. Schools, homes, shops, and offices became injury sites. The port had concentrated the hazard, but the pressure wave ignored the boundary between industry and town. A working morning changed in less time than sound needed to cross it. The responding firefighters near Pier O were killed and all 4 city fire vehicles were destroyed. Counts differ slightly across later records, but the operational result is clear. The city lost the force already connected to the hoses. At the moment, hundreds of new fires began. The people and equipment expected to fight them were gone. Communications were damaged too. A telephone operator's strike had been underway, though operators returned as soon as they learned what happened. Calls for help began moving through a broken city. Fire departments, police, hospitals, military posts, and relief groups around Galveston Bay started sending people and equipment toward Texas City. There was no working hospital in Texas City large enough for the disaster. City Hall, the Chamber of Commerce, and other buildings became treatment stations. The injured moved by ambulance, truck, boat, and private car toward Galveston, Houston, and military facilities. Supplies returned in the opposite direction: plasma, masks, blankets, food, and medical staff. The Army Corps of Engineers reached the waterfront by road and boat. Its crews established radio communication, carried casualties, delivered equipment, operated kitchens, surveyed the harbor, and began clearing navigation hazards. Police and military units closed roads. Volunteers brought water and food. The response grew because no single organization could contain the scale of the work. Dense smoke covered the dock district. Burning tanks and chemical releases made some routes impossible. Rescue workers searched through debris while new fires developed around them. The first explosion had ended in seconds, but the emergency had no clean edge. Every hour changed the map, and one damaged ship remained inside it. The port's sprinkler lines and water systems had been broken with the buildings they served. Some fires could be approached only through debris or contaminated water. Others burned inside tanks too large to reach. Crews had to choose between rescue, evacuation, and property they could no longer save. The fire map grew faster than the response map for most of the day. 600 feet from the Grandcamp the American cargo ship High Flyer had been loading at Pier A. It carried 1,050 tons of bulk sulfur in hold 2 and 961 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer in the next hold. Its main turbine was open for repair. Even before the blast, it could not leave under its own power. The first explosion tore the High Flyer from its moorings and drove it across the slip against the Wilson B. Keene *. Its stern anchor held. Wreckage and the 2 hulls became entangled. The crew abandoned ship. Any later attempt to save the port would depend on volunteer tug crews entering smoke, heat, and debris to move a powerless vessel. The blast had removed the High Flyer's hatch covers. Burning embers moved over the open holds. Investigators later presumed that fire entered the sulfur cargo first. Witnesses saw sulfur burning by early evening. By about 11 at night, ammonium nitrate was burning too. The exact route between those fires could not be reconstructed from inside the ship. The sulfur mattered. Federal tests found that sulfur contamination could make this fertilizer easier to detonate under confined test conditions. Investigators considered it a contributing cause aboard the High Flyer. They did not witness molten sulfur entering the nitrate hold. The physical path remained an informed reconstruction, not a photographed fact. By afternoon, tug crews from Galveston were trying to move the ship. They could not free the anchor or separate the hulls. Later crews returned. Hawsers parted under strain. Men used gas masks against sulfur dioxide while others worked with cutting torches. Every attempt took place inside a port still burning from the first explosion. The danger was now understood, but understanding did not produce control. The High Flyer was too damaged to sail and too trapped to tow. The local fire department was gone. Warehouses around the ship continued burning. Darkness removed visibility while the fires supplied their own harsh light. The port waited beside a second mass of heating nitrate. Near 11, crews made another attempt. The anchor chain was cut or finally pulled free. A larger hawser began drawing the High Flyer away from the Wilson B. Keene *. For a moment the ship moved, perhaps 50 to 100 feet. Then balls of fire rose from its holds. Tug crews cast off and withdrew. Warnings passed through the area. Most people had been cleared back. That evacuation changed what the second explosion would take from the city. It could not save the ships or warehouses, but it kept another crowd from forming around a danger that was finally visible for what it was. At about 1:10 a.m. on April 17th, the ammonium nitrate in the High Flyer detonated. The blast destroyed the ship and the Wilson B. Keene *. Warehouses and grain structures that had survived the first explosion collapsed. Hot fragments crossed the tank farms again and started new fires in a port already burning. The second blast killed far fewer people because the area had been evacuated. Contemporary counts disagree on whether 1 or at least 2 people died. Dozens were injured. The difference matters to the record, but not as a competition between explosions. It shows what changed when the hazard was recognized and distance was finally placed around it. Recognition came too late to prevent the second detonation, but it still changed the human result. The material had not become safer. The ship had not become easier to move. People had simply been moved away from it. Texas City had gained one piece of hazard control in the hours after losing almost everything else: separation. No final list could make the human count exact. 65 days after the disaster, the Red Cross and Texas Department of Public Safety reported 405 identified dead, 63 unidentified dead, and 100 people believed missing. Modern histories often use at least 581 deaths. The true total may never be known. The dead included firefighters, longshoremen, ship crews, plant workers, office staff, residents, and people who had come to watch. Some were local and known by name. Others were foreign seamen or temporary laborers who did not appear in city records. The uncertainty is part of the loss, not a reason to round it into certainty. About 3,000 people were injured. Glass and debris reached schools, homes, and streets well beyond the port. Hospitals in Galveston and Houston filled. Treatment stations worked under emergency light. The blast had lasted seconds, but injury, transport, surgery, identification, and burial extended through days and weeks. The high school gymnasium became a temporary morgue. Dental students helped identify the dead. Morticians worked in shifts, and identification continued into June. This film will not recreate those rooms or invent private final moments. The official record gives enough detail to understand the labor without turning the dead into evidence props. On June 22nd, unidentified victims were buried together in a memorial service. The city kept rebuilding around a cemetery that held names it did not know. That fact sits uneasily beside the industrial totals and damage estimates. A system can count tonnage precisely and still lose the identities of the people standing beside it. Investigators entered a waterfront in which 2 explosions and days of fire had overwritten one another. The asterisk Grandcamp asterisk was gone. The asterisk High Flyer asterisk had exploded later. Dense smoke had blocked photographs between the events. They worked from surviving witnesses, damage patterns, cargo records, laboratory samples, ship plans, and the few images taken before 9/12. The ignition question remained open. Cigarettes could ignite the paper and fertilizer mixture in some tests and failed in others. Investigators considered smoking the most probable explanation because control had been lax and smoking was observed near hold 4. Probability was not proof. The report preserved that difference, and so should every retelling. The larger finding was firm. The early fire had not been fought with water and volume. The hatches and ventilators had been closed. Steam had added heat. Combustible bags, wood, and paper had burned beside the oxidizer. Confinement held temperature and pressure inside a mass large enough to detonate. The report also followed responsibility beyond the ship. Hazard labels were weak. Shipping language softened the name of the cargo. Handlers lacked instruction. Rules were poorly understood and enforced. The port concentrated dangerous work beside tanks, plants, homes, and public roads without adequate safety control. No single correction could repair all of that. For the asterisk High Flyer asterisk, investigators traced a different route. The first blast opened its holds and trapped it against another ship. Embers likely ignited sulfur. Fire later reached the nitrate. Sulfur contamination may have increased sensitivity. Tug crews could not remove the hull before prolonged heating did its work. The second explosion shared the material, not the exact sequence. The federal committee recommended conspicuous labels, better separation from combustible cargo, temperature limits, designated loading areas, stricter smoking control, trained inspection, and clear firefighting practice. Its most direct instruction was simple. Cool the material quickly with large quantities of water, do not close in the heat, do not apply steam. The committee warned that rules on paper would not be enough. Safety required continuing education and people assigned to enforce the rules every day. Texas City had shown the gap between classification and practice. A substance could be listed as dangerous in Washington and still arrive at a working hold looking no more threatening than cement. Survivors and businesses brought hundreds of claims against the United States, which had organized the post-war fertilizer program. A federal trial court found for the claimants. The appeals court reversed it. In 1953, the Supreme Court held that the claims were barred by the discretionary function exception to the Federal Tort Claims Act. The decision was divided. The majority treated the challenged federal planning decisions as protected discretion. The dissent argued that a government directing a hazardous program should answer for preventable failures in its execution. Congress later passed a separate settlement law for Texas City claims. Recovery came through legislation after the ordinary suit had failed. Industry rebuilt quickly. Monsanto pledged to return, and other companies followed. Local plants formed mutual aid arrangements so equipment and crews could cross company boundaries during another emergency. The port recovered because its economic purpose remained. Recovery did not remove the same difficult fact that had shaped the city before the blast. Industry and community still shared the shoreline. In 1962, Texas City placed one of the asterisk Grandcamp's asterisk anchors in Memorial Park. The park also holds the unidentified dead and a memorial to the firefighters. The anchor is heavy evidence, but it does not explain the disaster by itself. It marks the force. The investigation explains the conditions that allowed that force to form. Texas City is sometimes remembered through the scale of the explosion. A wave, a flying anchor, shattered windows, a ship reduced to fragments. Those details are real, but scale alone teaches very little. The useful record begins earlier, with a paper bag, a missing label, an unopened valve, covered vents, and a steam line entering a hot hold. None of those objects had to fail in a dramatic way. The bag only had to burn, the label only had to be weak, the valve only had to stay closed. The vents only had to remain covered. A system becomes dangerous when ordinary actions keep passing their risk to the next person until no one is left with enough time or distance to stop it. The men in Hold 4 found a small fire. That is the hardest fact in the story. At that moment, the event was still small enough to fit between stacked bags and the side of a ship. 52 minutes later, it had crossed the city. The difference between those moments was not fate. It was the system built around the fire. Cold Wake is an autopsy of how proud things come apart. If the forgotten deserve a witness, subscribe. The next inquiry is already open.